Hello, friends. We are very interested to know which cities you are listening to us from, so quickly like and write in the comments where you are from. Also, share what shocking stories happened in your city or maybe even with you personally. Subscribe because the next story could be about your city or even your personal drama. Now let's dive into a new exciting story. Daniel Carter stood at the kitchen island in his spacious home in Austin, Texas, looking at Sophie, his 16-year-old daughter. She sat cross-legged on a high bar stool, casually scrolling through something on her phone. Her long brown hair fell over her shoulders, and her green eyes, so bright they sometimes seemed unnatural, were glued to the screen. On the table in front of her lay a half-eaten plate of the sandwich he had prepared half an hour ago, hoping to lure her out of the room for at least a short conversation. But Sophie, as usual lately, was somewhere in her own world, far from him. "So you came back late yesterday?" Daniel asked, trying to keep his voice casual. He was cutting an apple for Claire, the youngest daughter, who was sitting at the dining room table doodling with crayons. Claire hummed a cartoon tune to herself, her small fingers tightly gripping a red pencil. Sophie looked up from her phone, narrowing her eyes slightly, as if the question had taken her by surprise. She shrugged. "Not really. I was at Caitlin's and watched a movie. She returned around 11, probably." Daniel nodded, continuing to cut the apple into even slices. He noticed how her right hand rose to her ear, and her fingers began to lightly tug at the lobe, as if scratching it. It was a subtle movement, almost unnoticeable if you didn't know where to look. But Daniel knew. He had seen this habit before, not in Sophie, but in someone else. And this someone surfaced in his memory, like an old photograph that had not been taken out of an album for a long time. 11 then, he repeated, smiling at the corner of his lips. "And I think I heard the door slam closer to 1 in the morning. Or did it seem to me?" Sophie froze for a second, her fingers still fiddling with her ear. Then she snorted, rolling her eyes as only teenagers can. "Dad, are you serious? Are you setting a timer for me now?" "Maybe it was Ethan. He's always wandering around the house like a ghost." Daniel chuckled, glancing at Claire, who raised her head and said, "Ethan was sleeping yesterday when I went to bed. I saw him brushing his teeth at 9. Sophie shot her little sister an annoyed look, but quickly returned to her phone as if the conversation was over. Daniel placed the knife on the cutting board and dried his hands on the towel hanging on the oven handle. He wasn't going to push Sophie, at least not now. But something in her behavior, in this slight scratching of her ear, caught him like a splinter that could not be pulled out without pain. He remembered Mark Reynolds, his best friend from his college days at the University of Texas. Mark always scratched his ear when he lied. It was his chip, his tell, as they said in poker. He and Daniel and a couple of other guys often played on Fridays in the dorm, betting loose change and cheap beer. Mark was a master of bluff, but this ear scratching gave him away. Daniel caught him at it one day when Mark was trying to convince everyone that he had won a $100 bet against some frat guy. His ear itched, his eyes ran, and in the end Mark admitted that he just wanted to separate them. They then laughed until they cried, spilling beer on the shabby table. Daniel shook his head, pushing away the memory. Sophie is not Mark. She is his daughter, his eldest girl, who just recently asked him to throw her in the air in the backyard. But still he could not get rid of the strange feeling that settled somewhere in his chest, just below his ribs. It wasn't a suspicion, not yet. Just a slight prick, like from a needle that was accidentally left in your shirt. "Okay," he said, picking up a plate of apple slices, "I won't interrogate you. But if Caitlin has a movie night again, tell her to call me if anything happens. I don't want you wandering the streets alone at night." Sophie muttered something like, "Uh-huh," without looking up from her phone. Daniel walked over to the dining table and placed the plate in front of Claire, who immediately grabbed a slice and crunched it happily. "Thank you, Dad," she said, smiling so widely that her small gap-toothed teeth were visible. Her blonde hair, inherited from Lydia, was tied into 2 ponytails that bounced when she moved. "Eat well, baby," Daniel replied, patting her on the head. He returned to the kitchen island, casting another glance at Sophie. She was already looking at the screen again, but her hand was no longer touching her ear. Maybe he had an idea. Maybe it's just a coincidence. The door to the living room slammed and Ethan, Daniel's 13-year-old son, stumbled into the kitchen. His dark hair was disheveled, and in his hands he carried a sketchbook and a pencil. He silently walked to the refrigerator, opened it, and stared inside, as if food might appear there that had not been there 5 minutes ago. "Ethan, you ate an hour ago," Daniel noted, crossing his arms over his chest. "Or do you now have a bottomless stomach?" Ethan shrugged, pulled out a bottle of soda, and closed the door. "Just thinking," he muttered, sitting down at the table next to Claire. He opened the album and Daniel noticed a sketch of what looked like a city street with tall buildings. Ethan had been drawing since he could hold a pencil, and Daniel had always been proud of his talent. There was something of himself in this boy, a love of detail, of creating something out of nothing. "What are you thinking about?" Daniel asked, returning to his apple. He took a slice and took a bite, feeling the juice run down his chin. "Yes," Ethan shrugged again, which was his standard answer to everything. "Just school, I guess." Daniel nodded without insisting. Ethan wasn't the type to dump his thoughts on the table like poker cards. He kept them to himself like a treasure, and only revealed himself when he wanted to. Daniel respected that, although sometimes he wanted to grab his son by the shoulders and shake him to tell him something. The kitchen was filled with the usual noise: Claire humming, Ethan rustling a pencil on paper, Sophie occasionally tapping her nails on the phone screen. Daniel stood by the island, looking at his children, and tried to understand when everything became so distant. They lived under the same roof, ate at the same table, but each was in their own little world. Maybe this is normal for a family with teenagers, or was he himself missing something important? The door to the garage opened and Lydia, his wife, entered the kitchen. Her heels clicked on the tiles, and in her hands she held her purse and a phone, which, judging by the sound, was someone talking in a voice message. She was dressed in a strict gray suit, a pencil skirt, and jacket, emphasizing her slender figure. Her blonde hair was styled in a neat bun, and there was a slight smile on her lips that always appeared when she returned from work. "Hello, dear ones," she said, throwing her purse on the counter. She turned off the phone and looked at Daniel. "How was your day?" "Okay," he answered, wiping his hands on a towel. "And you? Are sales going on?" Lydia worked as a real estate agent, and in recent months she had been on the rise. Deals followed one after another, and she often stayed late showing houses to clients. Daniel got used to her schedule, although he sometimes joked that she spent more time with other people's families than with her own. "Oh yes," she smiled wider, taking off her jacket and hanging it over the back of her chair. "Today I closed the deal on a house in Westlake. 5 bedrooms, swimming pool, hill views. The clients are delighted." "Well done," said Daniel, sincerely happy for her. Lydia always knew how to find an approach to people, and her success at work was one of the reasons why he was proud of her. "We'll have to celebrate." "Definitely," she winked at him, and then turned to the children. "Why are you so quiet? Sophie, have you been on your phone all day again?" Sophie rolled her eyes, but didn't say anything. Lydia shook her head and walked over to Claire, looking at her drawing. "Wow, what a beauty. What is this, a castle?" "This is our house, only with a tower," Claire said proudly, pointing to the crooked structure of red and blue lines. "Gorgeous." Lydia kissed the top of her head and looked at Ethan. "And you, artist, what are you doing?" Ethan silently turned the album, showing a sketch of the street. Lydia whistled. "Talent," she said, patting him on the shoulder. Then she returned to Daniel, leaning on the counter next to him. "Well, chef, what will you feed us today?" "I was thinking about ordering pizza," he replied with a shrug, tired of fiddling with the stove. "Great." Lydia reached for his hand and squeezed it lightly. "You deserve a rest." Daniel smiled, feeling the warmth of her fingers. They had been married for almost 20 years, and although the passion of the first years had long since subsided, a familiar closeness remained between them, like between two trees that grew side by side. He looked at her tired but lively eyes, at the wrinkles in the corners of her lips and thought that, despite all their quarrels and omissions, she was still his Lydia. But then he noticed Sophie raise her hand to her ear again, answering Lydia's question about how her day had been. It was a fleeting movement, but it struck him again like lightning. Mark, ear scratching. Like, Dad, why are you hanging out? Sophie's voice pulled him out of his thoughts. She looked at him with slight irritation, as if he was interfering with her life. Nothing, he shook his head, forcing himself to smile. I was just thinking. Night fell over Austin softly, like a blanket, wrapping the suburban streets in the warm light of lanterns. The Carter house was quiet. The children had gone to their rooms. Lydia had taken a shower and gone to bed with a book, and Daniel was alone in the living room. The pizza they ate that night left empty boxes on the kitchen counter, and the smell of pepperoni still lingered in the air. He didn't clean up. He didn't have the strength. Instead, he sat on the couch, staring at the switched-off TV, which reflected his own face. Tired eyes, light stubble, dark hair with hints of gray. He was 42, but at that moment he felt 10 years older. The silence was oppressive. Usually she calmed him down after a working day filled with drawings, calls, and meetings with clients. Silence was a luxury. He loved his job as an architect. Designing houses, seeing ideas turn into concrete and glass, was almost an art to him. But today the silence did not bring peace. It rang in my ears like a distant alarm bell, and in this ringing emptiness the memory of Sophie scratching her ears surfaced again. And about Mark. Daniel rubbed his temples, trying to push the thought away. It was stupid. Coincidence. Everyone has habits. Some bite their nails, some twirl their hair, and Sophie scratches her ear. So what? It doesn't mean anything. But the more he tried to convince himself, the deeper the needle of suspicion pierced his consciousness. He got up from the sofa, walked to the bookcase against the wall, and ran his finger along the spines of the old albums. She and Lydia didn't open them. Often digital photos had long since replaced paper snapshots, and everything they wanted to save was in the cloud or on their hard drive. But these albums were from the early years of their marriage, when Sophie was a baby and Ethan was not yet born. Daniel pulled out one worn, with a dark green cover, and returned to the sofa. He didn't know why he was doing this. Maybe he wanted to remind himself how it all began. Maybe he was looking for something that he didn't yet understand. Opening the album, he inhaled the smell of old paper. The first shot is of him and Lydia in the backyard of their first home, a small ranch on the outskirts of Austin. She was 23, he was 25. She laughed, holding a garden hose in her hands, from which water was splashing, and he tried to dodge, covering his face with his hands. They were filmed by Mark. Daniel remembered him shouting, "Smile, you idiots, this is for the story." Then they were inseparable, Daniel, Lydia, and Mark, a trio that seemed eternal. He turned the page. Sophie, aged 2, with chubby cheeks and green eyes, sits on the grass with a toy shovel. Daniel smiled, remembering how she loved to dig holes in the garden, until Lydia began to grumble about how the lawn was turning into a battlefield. But then his gaze lingered on her face. Green eyes. Lydia has blue eyes, he has brown ones. Where did Sophie get that color? He frowned, trying to remember if there was anyone in their family with green eyes. Maybe his mother. No, hers were gray. Lydia's father, not either. Daniel turned a few more pages. Here is Ethan, just born, wrapped in a hospital blanket. His eyes were then dark, like all babies, but later they also became green. Daniel always thought it was just a genetic lottery. But now, looking at the pictures, he noticed something else. Sophie's sharp chin, Ethan's slightly raised cheekbones. It was familiar. Too familiar. He closed the album, feeling his heart beat faster. No, this is nonsense. He's just tired, overworked, and all sorts of things pop into his head. But his hands moved to the closet again, and he pulled out another album, the one that was dedicated to his friendship with Mark. Weddings, picnics, trips to Lake Travis. Daniel opened it to a random page and froze. Mark looked at him from the photograph. They stood by the fire, both in shorts and t-shirts, with bottles of beer in their hands. Mark laughed. His green eyes sparkled in the firelight, and his right hand was raised to his ear. He scratched it, as always, when he told another story. Daniel remembered that evening. Mark claimed that he had caught a fish the size of a dog, although everyone knew that he had returned from the lake empty-handed. They then teased him until the morning. Daniel turned his gaze to his reflection in the glass of the cabinet. His face was different, softer features, brown eyes, wide eyebrows. He was never like Mark, but Sophie, Ethan. He opened the first album again, finding a photo of Sophie at age 5. Her smile is slightly crooked, with a dimple on her right cheek. Mark had the same dimple. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He put the albums aside and walked into the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of water from the filter. His hand shook as he raised the glass to his lips. This is impossible. Lydia and Mark, his wife and his best friend. No, he would have noticed. He would have felt it. They had been married for almost 20 years, and Mark had been there the whole time, Sophie's godfather, the one who helped move furniture into the house, the one who always showed up at Thanksgiving with a stupid joke and a bottle of whiskey. But the more he thought, the more little things came to mind. How Lydia and Mark once got stuck in Houston because of a storm while going to a car show. How Mark often picked Sophie up from kindergarten because he was nearby. How Lydia laughed at Mark's jokes a little louder than necessary. These were little things that he never considered important. Until today. Daniel put the glass down and clenched his fists. He didn't want to believe it. I didn't even want to admit such a thought. But the photos lay there on the sofa, like silent witnesses, and he knew that he could not sleep until he looked again. He returned to the living room, picked up the album with their family photos, and began flipping through it faster, almost feverishly. Here's Sophie at her kindergarten graduation. Here's Ethan on his first day of school. Here's Claire, newly born, her tiny hands clenched into fists. Claire, her eyes were blue, like Lydia's, not green. This calmed him down a little. At least Claire, his baby, was out of this nightmare that he had invented for himself. He closed the album and leaned back on the sofa, closing his eyes. The clock on the wall showed midnight. The house was asleep, but Daniel felt like he was in a storm. He didn't know what to do next. Should I ask Lydia? Should I call Mark? Or just forget, chalk it all up to fatigue and paranoia? But the scratching of Sophie's ear, those green eyes, that dimple on her cheek, they didn't give him peace. He stood up, put the albums back in the closet, and turned off the light in the living room. Climbing the stairs, he looked into Sophie's room. She was sleeping, curled up under the covers, her phone lying next to her pillow. Then to Ethan's room. He was sleeping on his side. His sketchbook was open on the nightstand. And finally, to Claire, she was breathing evenly, hugging a stuffed rabbit. Daniel looked at his children and felt something tighten in his chest. They were his life. Daniel woke up with a heavy head, as if he had been carrying stones all night. Lydia had already gotten up. He heard the sound of water from the bathroom, where she was taking her morning shower. Sunlight streamed through the blinds, streaking the wood floor of their bedroom. He lay looking at the ceiling and tried to collect his thoughts, but they scattered like cockroaches from the light. Yesterday's photos from albums, Sophie's green eyes, scratching her ear, all this was spinning in my head, giving me no rest. And then, like a lightning strike, that weekend flashed back into my memory. This was 10 years ago. She, Lydia, and Mark were planning a trip to Houston. Mark wanted to see a car show. Lydia volunteered to help negotiate a house, and Daniel was supposed to join later, but stayed home because of an urgent project. Then a storm passed over. Texas roads were flooded, flights were canceled. Lydia and Mark called him in the evening, saying they were stuck in a motel on the highway and would be back as soon as the water subsided. Daniel didn't suspect anything strange. He trusted them. This was his wife and his best friend. They laughed on the phone. Mark joked about wet boots. Lydia complained of boredom. Everything seemed normal. Until this morning. Daniel sat up in bed, rubbing his face with his hands. The sound of water from the bathroom died down, and he heard Lydia turn on the hairdryer. Her phone lay on the nightstand on his side, black, shiny, with a cracked corner of the screen. He looked at him, and it clicked in his head. He needed to know. This is his wife, his family, his life. He has the right. No remorse, no doubts, just take it and check it out. He reached out, grabbed the phone, and entered the password. She hadn't changed it in years. Sophie's birthday, 0509. The screen flickered to reveal the main menu. Daniel immediately went to messages. He didn't know what he was looking for, but his fingers scrolled through the chats themselves. Here is a correspondence with a client about a house in Westlake. Here with a friend about a new restaurant. Here with him a short "buy milk" from yesterday. And then he saw the name, Mark. He opened the chat and his heart sank. The correspondence was long. Lydia didn't bother to remove them. She considered him so blind, so gullible, that she did not even try to cover her tracks. The first thing that caught his eye was, "Meet me at the Red Rose on Friday. Tell him you have a show." Daniel frowned. The Red Rose is a motel an hour outside of Austin. He remembered Lydia once leaving for a home showing on a Friday night. She returned late and said that the clients had been choosing for a long time. He believed. Further worse. "I love it when you're around, but I have to be careful." He scrolled further, and each message hit like a fist in the chest. "Come to my salon after work. Tell me that you're late with the documents. He won't even ask." And emoticons, hearts, kisses, grins. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. This was not just betrayal. It was a whole life on two fronts that Lydia led right under his nose. But he, an idiot, didn't see anything. I didn't notice anything. I trusted her like a child who believes in fairy tales. The bathroom door opened and Daniel quickly turned off his phone, throwing it back on the nightstand. Lydia came out, wrapped in a towel, with wet hair falling over her shoulders. She smiled at him as if nothing had happened. "Good morning, sleepyhead," she said, going to the closet. "Did you go to bed late yesterday?" "Yes," he muttered, trying to keep his voice even. "I couldn't sleep." Poor thing, she cast a sympathetic glance at him, pulling on her dress. "Maybe you can make some coffee. I'm running to a meeting this morning." Daniel nodded, getting out of bed. He couldn't look her in the eye. Only one question was spinning in my head. How? How could he be so blind? 20 years of marriage, 3 children, hundreds of evenings together, and all this time she lied. And Mark, his brother in spirit, his partner in life, was part of this deception. They laughed at him. They planned meetings while he sat at home or in the office, drawing house plans for other people's families. He went down to the kitchen, put on the coffee maker, and stared out the window. The street was calm. A neighbor was walking his dog. The postman was delivering letters. An ordinary morning. But everything changed for Daniel. He recalled other moments, how Lydia often left on business, how Mark offered to take her home if Daniel was late at work. Everything was coming together like a puzzle that he didn't want to see before. Lydia came down 10 minutes later, already packed makeup, heels, handbag over her shoulder. She took the mug of coffee he poured and kissed him on the cheek. "Thank you, darling. See you tonight, okay?" "Yeah," he nodded, without looking at her. She left, slamming the door, and Daniel remained standing at the stove. He didn't understand how he could have missed it for so many years. Lydia and Mark played with him like a doll, and he batted his eyes and smiled. Daniel sat at his desk in his office, but the blueprints for the new house in Barton Hills lay untouched. The laptop screen glowed with confirmation of the order. 4 sets of DNA for him, Sophie, Ethan, and Claire. He decided not to leave any questions unanswered. The site promised delivery in 2 days and results within a week after sending the samples. Daniel added express shipping for an additional $50. He needed the truth, and he couldn't wait any longer. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. After yesterday morning, when he saw Lydia's messages with Mark, his world cracked like glass under attack. This was no longer just a suspicion. It was an abyss into which he would either fall or step over. But this requires facts. DNA doesn't lie. If the children are not his, he will know. If it is, so much the better. And then he will decide what to do with Lydia and Mark. For now, he just wanted clarity. Daniel stood up and walked out into the corridor. The sound of running water could be heard from the bathroom as Sophie was taking a shower. He walked into her room, where a comb with long brown hair and teeth was lying on the floor. He quickly pulled out a few hairs and put them in his pocket. Then he went down to the living room. Ethan sat on the couch, doodling in a sketchbook, his Texas Longhorns baseball cap lying next to him. "Ethan, what are you drawing?" Daniel asked, coming closer. "A street with cars," muttered the son, without looking up from the paper. "You'll show me later," Daniel said, quietly brushing a few dark hairs from his baseball cap. He clenched them in his fist and moved on. Claire was in her room, playing with dolls on the carpet. Her blonde ponytails bounced as she moved. Daniel sat down next to him. "Hello, baby. Can I straighten your hair?" he asked, smiling. "Yes, Dad." She nodded, and he took her small comb from the bedside table, ran it through her hair, and took out a few blonde strands that were stuck in the teeth. "That's it, beauty," he said, patting her on the head, and left. In the bedroom, he took out his comb, pulled out some of his hair, and put everything into 4 Ziploc bags from the kitchen drawer. Signed, D.S.I.K. Ready. He hid the bags in his jacket pocket and took the phone. I had to tell someone so I wouldn't go crazy. Rachel, his sister, was the only option. He dialed her number, and she answered on the second ring. "Dan, what happened?" Rachel's voice was tired, but alive. She was clearly on shift at the hospital. "Ratch, I need to talk." "This is important," he said, trying not to break down. "Wait." Footsteps and the sound of a door were heard. "That's it, I'm in the restroom." "Spit it out." Daniel took a breath and blurted out, "I think Lydia is cheating on me with Mark, and that the children are not mine. All 3. "Damn, Dan," Rachel breathed. "Are you serious? This is an explosion. I saw her messages with Mark. They dated for years. They wrote that I wouldn't notice anything. I didn't even notice." His voice trembled, but he continued, "I ordered DNA tests. For myself, Sophie, Ethan, and Claire. Already collected my hair. I'll send it tomorrow. Tests for everyone." Her tone became sharper. "Do you understand what this means? If even one is not yours, everything will collapse. And if they're not all yours, Jesus, Dan." "I understand." He squeezed the phone. "But I have to know. I can't live with this lie in my head. If they're not mine, I'll sort it out. If mine, I will deal with Lydia and Mark differently." "Okay," Rachel paused. "It's your right. But be careful. You're opening a drawer that you won't close." "What then?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "First the truth, then steps." "Okay," she sighed. "I'm with you. How can I help?" "Just be there. And don't tell anyone, even Mom." "I won't tell," she chuckled. "But Dan, if Mark and Lydia really did this, I'll strangle them myself. Just don't mess things up while you're waiting for results. Do you promise?" "I'll try," he lied. Anger was already burning inside, and Rachel felt it. "You're stubborn like Dad," she grinned. "Keep me posted. And hang in there, brother. I'm nearby." "Thank you, Ratch," he smiled, albeit through force. "You're the best." Otherwise, she laughed, and the call ended. Daniel put down the phone and looked at the jacket with the bags. He felt like a spy in his own home, but it was necessary. These are his children, his family, and he will not allow Lydia and Mark to continue to lead him by the nose. He remembered how Mark had patted him on the shoulder at the barbecue, how Lydia had smiled at him at dinner. It was all false, and he was a blind fool. Lydia's voice came from below. She had returned from work. "Dan, I'm home. I brought Chinese food." "I'm coming," he shouted, hiding his jacket in the closet. He went down to the kitchen, where Lydia was laying out containers of noodles and rice. She looked as usual, beautiful, confident, without a trace of guilt. "How is the day?" she asked, holding out her chopsticks. "Okay," he took them, avoiding her gaze. "And you?" "Another deal," she smiled. "The bonus is coming soon." "Cool," he muttered, opening the container. The food smelled delicious, but there was no appetite. Daniel stood at the grill in his backyard, flipping ribs. Smoke rose into the air, mingling with the smell of roasting meat and freshly cut grass. Saturday barbecues were a tradition not weekly, but frequent enough that neighbors and friends knew that if the Carters called, there would be food, beer, and noise. Today, he invited Mark and Jessica, several of Lydia's colleagues, and a couple of neighbors. The kids were running around the yard. Sophie was chatting with a friend by the pool. Ethan was throwing a ball with a neighbor's son, and Claire was splashing around in an inflatable pool with a rubber ducky. Everything looked perfect, but Daniel was seething inside. DNA tests were sent yesterday. He received the kits in the morning, quickly collected the samples into envelopes, and took them to the post office while Lydia was at a meeting with a client. Now all that was left was to wait a week, maybe less if the laboratory hurried up. This week will be the longest of his life. He didn't sleep the second night, replaying Lydia's messages with Mark in his head, Sophie's green eyes, her ears scratching. He wanted results, but was afraid of them. And while the truth hung in the air, he decided to observe. Lydia stood at the snack table, laughing at something Mark said. She was wearing a light sundress, her hair down, and a glass of lemonade in her hands. Mark, wearing shorts and a t-shirt with the logo of his car dealership, held a bottle of beer and gesticulated as he told another story. Daniel looked at them through the smoke of the grill, and their every gesture, every glance cut him like a knife. And then this guy says, "I thought it was a discount." Mark burst out laughing, slapping his knee. Lydia threw back her head, her laughter ringing like a bell. Too loud, too sincere. She placed her hand on his shoulder, as if by accident, but her fingers lingered a little longer than necessary. Mark caught her eye, grinned and winked. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but Daniel noticed. He squeezed the tongs until the metal dug into his palm. They are not just friends. This was not a friendly chat. It was a chemistry that he had previously mistaken for the habit of old acquaintances. Now she was screaming in his face. He remembered the messages, "I love it when you're around." How many times had they stood side by side like this while he fried meat or fussed with the children? How many times have you laughed at his back? "Dan, the ribs are burning." Jessica, Mark's wife, shouted as she approached with a plate of pies from her bakery. Her voice pulled him out of his thoughts. He blinked as he saw that the meat was starting to turn black on one side. "Damn," he muttered, quickly turning over the ribs. "Thank you, Jess." "You're welcome," she smiled, putting the plate on the table. "You're kind of thoughtful today." "Everything is fine?" "Yes, just tired," he lied, forcing a smile. Jessica nodded and walked away to the children, and Daniel glanced at Mark and Lydia. They had already separated. Lydia went to her colleagues. Mark went to the refrigerator for another beer. But this moment, the hand on the shoulder, the wink remained in my head like a photograph. He began to notice little things. The way Mark looked at Sophie as she ran past, not just with a godfather's smile, but with something more. How Lydia cast short glances at Mark when she thought no one was looking. The way they joke, finishing each other's sentences, as if they had been rehearsing this for years. All this was always in front of him, but he was blind. Now the eyes were open, and the paranoia was growing by the minute. Daniel took the ribs off the grill, placed them on a platter, and shouted, "The food is ready." The guests gathered at the table, children came running, noise filled the yard. He sat down next to Lydia, but could not bring himself to talk to her. She was chatting with a neighbor about some house, and he was silently chewing meat, watching Mark across the table. He was telling a joke, waving his arms, and caught Daniel's eye. He smiled and picked up a bottle of beer. "For you, Dan, best grill master in Austin." Everyone laughed, and Daniel nodded, giving a tight smile. Inside, he imagined himself getting up, turning the table over and punching Mark right in that grinning face. But he restrained himself. The barbecue went on for another couple of hours. The guests ate, drank, and chatted. Daniel played his role master, husband, father. But a plan was already emerging in my head. But everything will depend on the DNA results. The barbecue ended in the evening. The guests left, the children went into the house. Mark and Jessica were the last to leave. Mark patted Daniel on the shoulder goodbye. "Great day, brother. We'll do it again soon," he said, getting into his pickup truck. "Definitely," Daniel answered, looking at his back. "Soon, very soon." He stayed to clear the table, stacking the plates and bottles. Lydia went to take a shower. The children scattered to their rooms. Alone, under the stars, Daniel thought about how they managed to make a cuckold out of him. Daniel sat in his office, looking at his laptop screen. The letter from the laboratory arrived 5 minutes ago, but he hesitated to open it. His hands lay on the table, his fingers trembled. A week has passed since the DNA tests were sent, a week full of stress, lack of sleep, and fake smiles. He had been waiting for this, but now that the moment had come, fear gripped him. What if the children are not his? He clenched his jaw and clicked on the letter. Topic: DNA analysis results. Inside is a PDF file. Daniel opened it, and the text hit his eyes. Sophie Carter, 0% match with Daniel Carter. Ethan Carter, 0% match. Claire Carter, 99.9% match. He reread it. Sophie and Ethan are not his. Claire is his daughter. Facts, cold and clear, like a knife in the back. The world has collapsed. Daniel felt the ground disappear from under his feet, although he sat motionless. My breathing became ragged, as if a bomb had exploded in my chest. He closed his eyes, but the numbers still glowed in front of him. 0%, 0%, 99.9%. 20 years of marriage, 16 years with Sophie, 13 with Ethan, all lies. Lydia and Mark stole his family by slipping him other people's children, but he didn't see. Only Claire remained the real one, with her blue eyes and ringing laugh. He stood up, staggering, and went to the window. Behind the glass is a sunny day, children on bicycles, cars, and inside him there is emptiness and anger. He clenched his fists until it hurt. How dare they? He remembered Sophie scratching her ear, Ethan with his green eyes, Lydia and Mark laughing at the barbecue. Everything worked out. They lied to his face, and he raised their children thinking it was his blood. But then something clicked. Sophie and Ethan are not his DNA, but he is their father. He was there when they took their first steps, read books to them, taught them to ride a bicycle. Mark has no rights to them, he just hid behind his back. And Lydia won't take them to continue her lies. They are his children, and he will fight for all three of them. And the traitors will pay. Daniel grabbed his phone and found the number of Tom Grayson, his lawyer. Tom was tough as steel and knew how to win a case. If anyone will help him crush Lydia and Mark, it will be him. Daniel pressed call and Tom answered after 3 rings. Dan, hi, what happened? Tom's voice was hoarse, but cheerful. Tom, I need a divorce. Urgent, Daniel said, without wasting time on introductions. And custody of all the children. Damn it, Tom whistled. What's happened? Lydia? She cheated on me with Mark. For years. The DNA came. Sophie and Ethan are not mine, Claire is mine. But I want all 3. They are my children, and these 2 will pay child support. Tom was silent for a second, then cursed. Dirty bastards. Are you confident in the tests? 100%. Daniel squeezed the phone. Sophie and Ethan 0%. Claire 99.9%. No errors. Okay, Tom's voice became businesslike. Divorce due to infidelity. DNA is our main argument. Guardianship of all 3 is more difficult, but it can be pushed through. Sophie and Ethan are not yours biologically, but you raised them. The court will take this into account. Do you want alimony from Lydia and Mark? Yes, he answered firmly. They ruined my life. Let them pay for it. For every child. Great, Tom chuckled. We'll sue Lydia for infidelity and demand alimony. We'll bring in Mark as the father of Sophie, and Ethan will do another test if necessary. Do you want it quietly or with a bang? Daniel remembered his plan for the party public exposure. He still wanted it, but now with a new goal. Not just to humiliate, but to take everything. It's quiet for now, he said. Prepare the papers, collect evidence. I'll decide how to serve them later. Got it, Tom coughed. The documents will be ready in a couple of days. Come to the office tomorrow, we'll sort out the details. And Dan, don't do anything stupid before that. I won't, he lied. Anger was already burning inside, and Tom felt it. You sound like a man on a mission. Hold on, brother. Tom passed out. Daniel threw the phone on the table and put his head in his hands. His world was shattered into pieces. Sophie and Ethan are Mark's children by blood, but he won't give them up. He is their father, not the one hiding in the shadows. Claire is his own daughter, and this gave him a foothold. He wouldn't let Lydia and Mark take away anything he'd built. Footsteps in the corridor. Lydia returned from the store. Dan, I'm home. I bought groceries. Can you help? Her voice was light, carefree. He didn't answer. He closed the laptop, hid the printout in a drawer, and put on his usual mask. He went downstairs and took the bags from her hands. Of course, he said, looking into her eyes. She smiled, suspecting nothing, but Daniel was seething inside. Daniel stood at the kitchen island, stirring his mug of coffee. It had been a day since he'd received the DNA results, and the anger inside him wasn't just smoldering, it was blazing like wildfire. Sophie and Ethan are not his blood, but he won't give them up. Claire is his daughter, and that gave him something to stand on. Lydia and Mark had ruined his life, but he wasn't about to go quietly. A conversation with Tom yesterday gave him a plan. Divorce, custody of all children, alimony from traitors. But this was not enough. He wanted them to feel the pain he felt. And the party, that same barbecue idea, became his weapon. He decided to call it the opening of spring. It sounds innocent, festive, ideal for deception. It will be a surprise, a public blow where he will expose their lies to everyone who knows them. Mark's employees, Lydia's friends, relatives, everyone will become witnesses. He already saw how their faces would stretch out, how Lydia would turn pale, how Mark would begin to make excuses. This won't be just a divorce. This will be an execution. Daniel picked up the phone and started making a guest list. First up are Mark and Jessica. Mark must be there to collapse with Lydia. Jessica deserved to know the truth about her husband. Then the employees of Mark's car dealership, manager Tony, mechanic Rick, a couple of salesmen. They always praised Mark as a boss. Let them see who he really is. Next are Lydia's friends from her realtor circle. Sarah, who always dragged her to bachelorette parties, and Kate, a lover of gossip. They adored Lydia, the sweeter their shock would be. And of course, relatives. His sister Rachel, who is already in the know, Lydia's parents living in Dallas, and even Mark's aunt, who is always bragging about his successes. There are about 50 people in total, enough to put on a show. He opened the messaging app and texted Mark. Hey brother, on Saturday I'm throwing a surprise party, opening of spring. Come with Jess at 6. Tell your guys from the salon, Tony, Rick, the rest. It'll be fun. Mark responded a minute later. Cool, Dan. We're in business. I'll tell the guys. What's the reason? It's just like that. It's spring, Daniel typed, grinning. Let him think it's a friendly evening. Then he sent messages to the other short ones with the same text. Surprise, opening of spring party on Saturday, 6 p.m. with us. Come, it will be great. Rachel got a separate one. You know why? Be there. She responded with a fist emoji, her silent support. Lydia entered the kitchen as he finished his coffee. She was wearing sportswear and had just returned from a run. Sweat glistened on her forehead and her cheeks were flushed. She looked alive, happy, and this infuriated him even more. Good morning, she said, opening the refrigerator. You got up early. I couldn't sleep, he answered, looking at her over the top of his mug. I was thinking about business. Oh, poor thing, she pulled out a bottle of water and smiled. Maybe we can do something fun this weekend. Let's relax. Daniel resisted the urge to throw the mug at the wall. Instead, he nodded. Already figured it out. There will be a surprise party on Saturday. Opening of spring. I'll invite everyone, Mark, your friends, your family. I want to acknowledge your work. You've closed so many deals. Lydia's eyes lit up. She placed the bottle on the table and clapped her hands. Seriously, Dan, this is so sweet. I'm delighted. She ran up to him and hugged him, pressing her cheek to his chest. You are the best husband in the world. He froze, feeling her warmth. Her scent, a mixture of sweat and floral shampoo, was familiar, but now nauseating. the best husband. She lied to his face, and he was blind. But he hugged her back, squeezing her a little tighter than necessary, and smiled. "I'm glad you like it," he said, releasing her. "It will be unforgettable." "Oh, I'm sure," she laughed, taking a sip of water. "I'll have to choose a dress and call Sarah and Kate. They love parties." "I already called," he nodded. "And Mark and Jess. His guys from the salon, too." "Great," Lydia beamed. "It will be like the good old days. Mark and I always knew how to get the crowd going." Daniel clenched his teeth, and I cut like a blade. She didn't even try to hide their closeness. But he nodded, holding the mask. "Yes, you are masters," he said, putting the mug in the sink. "I'll take care of it. You just come and enjoy it." "You're a miracle." She kissed him on the cheek and went into the shower, humming something cheerful. Daniel stared after her, feeling anger mixed with cold determination. She's delighted. Great. Let her think that this is her holiday. He walked into the living room, picked up a notepad, and began jotting down details. Food catering to don't mess around with it yourself. Drinks, beer, wine, lemonade for children. Music playlist with speakers. And the main thing is the moment when he lays his cards on the table. Divorce papers from Tom, DNA copies, maybe even printouts of Lydia's messages with Mark, if he finds more. All this will fall in front of the guests like a bomb. He imagined her face shock, tears, attempts to justify himself. Mark, blushing and muttering something in front of his employees. Jessica leaving in tears. This won't be just a revelation. This will be their end. And he will take the children, all three, and force them to pay child support for every year of deception. Daniel closed the notebook and exhaled. The plan is ready. Just have to wait until Saturday. Daniel sat in his office, looking at his phone screen. The party was tomorrow, and everything went according to plan. The guests confirmed their arrival, catering was ordered, drinks were already in the garage. But this was just a shell, the real work began now. He was going to turn the opening of spring into a scene where Lydia and Mark would collapse under the weight of their lies. This required the finishing touches, divorce papers and evidence that he would throw in their faces in front of everyone. And all this must be written down. He dialed Tom Grayson's number. The lawyer answered almost immediately, with the usual hoarseness in his voice. "Dan, hi. The papers are ready. What's next?" Tom asked without unnecessary introductions. "Tom, I need you to come to the party tomorrow," Daniel said, tapping his fingers on the table. "At 6 at my house, and bring the divorce papers. I want you to hand them to Lydia right there in front of everyone." Tom whistled. "Are you serious? Public blow? It's going to be loud, Dan." "That's right," Daniel's voice was firm. "She cheated on me with Mark for years. Sophie and Ethan are his children. Claire is mine. I will take all three, and they will pay child support. But I want them to fall in front of the crowd. Let everyone see who they are." "Hard," Tom chuckled. "I like it. I have documents: divorce, custody, alimony request. DNA tests are attached. I can walk in the middle of the party and give her the papers formally, like a bailiff, only with a smile." "Great," Daniel nodded, although Tom didn't see it. "Come at 7. I'll start at 6. Let them relax, and then you can come in. Be prepared, there will be about 50 people, their friends, colleagues, relatives." 50? Tom laughed. "This is not a party, this is a tribunal. Okay, I'm in. Anything else? That's all for now." "Just be there," Daniel said. "And thank you, Tom." "My pleasure. See you tomorrow." Tom hung up. Daniel put the phone down and exhaled. "The first part is ready. Tom will hand over the papers. It will be like a point-blank shot." But he wanted more. He wanted this moment to remain forever, not only in the memory of the guests, but also on the recording. Lydia and Mark will not be able to get away when their shame is on video. He opened his laptop and started looking for a videographer. After half an hour of searching, he found a guy named Eric, a local freelancer who photographed weddings and corporate events. There was a portfolio on the website, bright shots, clear sound, reviews about how it captures emotions. Daniel grinned. There will be some emotions. He called, "Hello, this is Eric." The voice on the other end was young and energetic. "Hello, Eric. My name is Daniel Carter. I need a videographer for tomorrow, a party at my house. From 6 to 9, approximately. Can you?" "Tomorrow." Eric hesitated. "I was free." "Yes, I can." "What kind of event?" "Surprise spring opening party," Daniel said, keeping his tone light. "I want to preserve memories for my family. Just film everything: the guests, the toasts, the general atmosphere. Nothing complicated." "Cool, sounds cool," Eric perked up. $100 an hour, 3 hours, 300. "Fits." "Okay," Daniel nodded. "Come by 6, I'll send you the address." "And Eric, don't turn off the camera, even if it's noisy. I want to capture everything." "No problem," Eric replied. "See you tomorrow." Daniel hung up the call and sent the address. The videographer is the second part of the plan. Eric will film how Tom hands over the papers, how Lydia turns pale, how Mark begins to mutter excuses. This will not just be revenge, it will be proof. If the case goes to trial, the recording will show their reaction, their guilt. Maybe he'll even post it online so Austin knows who Lydia Carter and Mark Reynolds are. He stood up and walked into the living room, where Lydia was sitting on the sofa, leafing through a magazine. She looked up and smiled. "You're kind of busy today," she said, putting down the magazine. "Everything for tomorrow?" "Yes," he nodded, sitting down next to her. "I want everything to be perfect. For you." "You're sweet." She reached out and touched his hand. "I told Sarah and Kate yesterday. They were delighted. And Mark called and said that he would come with Jess and the guys from the salon. It will be great." "Yes, yes," Daniel smiled, but everything shrank inside. She had no idea that she was walking into a trap. "I ordered catering. The drinks are already there." He even hired a videographer to film everything. "Videographer?" Her eyebrows shot up. "Dan, you've outdone yourself. It's like a wedding." "Almost," he shrugged. "I want us to remember this day." "You're the best." She kissed him on the cheek and returned to the magazine. Daniel looked at her smile, her relaxed posture, and felt anger mingling with cold determination. She thought it was her holiday. Let him think. Tomorrow she will know that this is her end. It was Friday afternoon, and the sun hung low over Austin, bathing the streets in a golden light. Tomorrow at 6 the party will start, the opening of spring, a trap that Daniel has been preparing all week. A volume of documents, videographer Eric, 50 guests, everything was in place. But today he wanted silence. The last calm day before his life, and the lives of Lydia and Mark shatter into pieces. He decided to take the children to the park. Maybe it was a way to remind himself what he was fighting for. Maybe just delay the inevitable. "Sophie, Ethan, Claire, get ready. We're going to Zilker Park," he called from the kitchen, where he was putting bottles of water and a bag of chips into his backpack. Lydia was at another meeting with a client. He no longer asked whether it was true or not. She wouldn't be there until the evening, and that gave him time with the children. Sophie came down first, wearing jeans and a t-shirt, phone in hand. "Seriously, Dad?" "To the park." "I'm 16, I'm not a child." She rolled her eyes, but still went to the car. "This will be fun," Daniel said, trying to sound cheerful. "Fresh air won't hurt anyone." Ethan followed, sketchbook under his arm. He nodded silently and sat in the back seat. Claire was the last to run out, wearing a bright yellow dress and holding a rubber ball. "Dad, are we going to play?" she asked, jumping up and down. "Of course, baby," he smiled, patting her on the head. It was the first real smile in a week. They reached Zilker Park in 15 minutes. The place was crowded with families, dogs, cyclists, but Daniel found a quiet spot near the Barton Springs River. Sophie immediately went to the bench, burying her face in her phone. Ethan sat down under a tree and began to draw a sketch of a river and a bridge. Claire pulled Daniel towards the grass. "Let's play ball," she said, throwing him a rubber ball. He caught it and nodded. They threw the ball to each other, and her laughter rang in the air like a bell. Daniel looked at her blonde ponytails, blue eyes, dimples, and felt his heart clench. She is his daughter. DNA proved it. But Sophie and Ethan. He glanced at them. Sophie was chatting with someone. Ethan was concentrating on the paper. They are not his by blood, but he raised them. They were his children, and tomorrow he would prove it to himself, to Lydia, to Mark, to the court. Claire caught the ball and suddenly stopped, looking at it. "Dad, why are you sad?" she asked, tilting her head. Her voice was quiet, but direct, as only children can. Daniel froze. He didn't think it was noticeable. He wore a mask all week. He smiled at Lydia, joked with his colleagues, and behaved with the children. But Claire, his baby, saw right through it. He knelt down to be level with her and forced himself to smile. "I'm not sad, honey," he lied. "I'm just tired. There is a lot to do at work, drawings, projects. You always say that when you're sad," she frowned, squeezing the ball. "Is it because of Mom?" Daniel swallowed. Her question struck like lightning. He didn't expect her to connect this with Lydia. Maybe the children felt more than he thought, but he shook his head. "No, not because of Mom, just grown-up stuff. But listen," he took her small hands in his, "no matter what happens, I will always be with you. With you, with Sophie, with Ethan. Always. I promise." Claire looked at him, her blue eyes sparkling. Then she nodded. "Okay, Dad, I believe you." She hugged him, pressing her to her chest. He hugged her back, feeling the warmth of her small body. It was a promise he wouldn't break. Tomorrow he will take them all, not for the sake of blood, but for the sake of what he did for them. Mark has no rights to them. Lydia too. "Let's play some more," he said, pulling away. Claire smiled and threw the ball. They continued, and for a moment Daniel forgot about tomorrow. But only for a moment. Sophie arrived half an hour later, putting her phone in her pocket. "Dad, can I go home? Caitlin is calling for a movie," she said, crossing her arms. "Okay," he nodded. "We're getting ready." He called Ethan, who silently closed the album and stood up. They returned to the car, and the children loaded inside. Claire was chatting about how the ball almost went into the river. Sophie was writing something on her phone. Ethan was looking out the window. Daniel drove the car, listening to their voices. This was his family, not Lydia, not Mark. Hi. At home, he sent Sophie to her friend. Ethan went to his room, and Claire turned on a cartoon. Daniel walked into the garage and checked out the drinks and decor for tomorrow. Everything was ready. Catering, Tom with papers, Eric with camera. He imagined how Lydia smiled at the guests, how Mark patted him on the shoulder, and then silence, to when the truth would come out. It's going to be a storm. But today there was a lull. Lydia returned late when the children were already asleep. She walked into the bedroom where Daniel was reading a book, pretending to be calm. "Tired?" she asked, taking off her shoes. "A little." He closed the book. "Tomorrow is a big day." "Yes, I'm looking forward to it." She smiled, lying down next to him. "Thank you for organizing everything. You are the best." "I'm trying," he said, looking at the ceiling. She did not know that this was her last evening in this house as his wife. Tomorrow everything will change. He turned on his side, his back to her, and closed his eyes. The calm is over. The storm was close. Saturday came quickly, and by 6 p.m. Daniel Carter's Austin home was a hive of activity. The backyard was decorated with fairy lights. The tables were laden with food, ribs, burgers, salads from the caterer, and the garage was stocked with cases of beer, wine, and soda. There were more than 50 guests. Mark's team from the car dealership, Lydia's friends, neighbors, relatives. Everything went according to plan. Daniel stood at the entrance, greeting the arrivals, with a tight smile on his face. Inside, he was like a taut string, ready to snap. It wasn't just a party, it was a trap. Mark and Jessica arrived first. Mark climbed out of his truck, wearing jeans and a shirt with the sleeves rolled up, with a bottle of whiskey in his hand, his usual contribution on such evenings. Jessica, wearing a light dress, carried a tray of pies from her bakery. Mark patted Daniel on the shoulder. "Dan, you made a real holiday," he said, grinning. Where is the beer? We need to start with acceleration. In the garage, Daniel answered, nodding. Get settled. Jessica smiled and walked into the yard, and Mark lingered, glancing at the house. Lydia already here? He asked, as if inadvertently. Yes, he's getting ready, Daniel said, feeling his fists clenching in his pockets. Coming out soon. Mark nodded and went to the guests. Next came the team from the dealership. Tony, the loud-voiced manager, Rick, the mechanic with tattoos on his arms, and a couple of young salesmen. They brought a case of beer and immediately began making noise, discussing Mark's latest deal. Daniel greeted them, pointing to the table with food. Then Lydia's friends came, Sarah and Kate, both in bright dresses, with glasses of wine, which they seemed to have started at home. They squealed when they saw the garlands and began taking pictures of everything. Dan, this is gorgeous, Sarah shouted, hugging him. Lydia is lucky to have such a husband. I'm trying, he forced a smile, moving towards the door. The neighbors, the Johnson family with 2 children, and the elderly Mrs. Kelly were already in the yard, trying burgers. Relatives also came along. Lydia's parents from Dallas, Aunt Mark with her eternal stories about the good old days, and Rachel, who entered last. She caught Daniel's eye and nodded silently. She knew what would happen next. Lydia came downstairs at 7:30, and the courtyard fell silent for a moment. She was wearing a figure-hugging red dress, with her hair down and light makeup. The guests applauded and someone whistled. She smiled, waved, and walked over to Daniel. You've outdone yourself, darling, she said, kissing him on the cheek. This is amazing. I tried for you, he answered, looking into her eyes. She didn't notice the coldness in his voice. Her smile was sincere, and this infuriated him even more. Eric, the videographer, was already there. A young guy in a cap with a camera on a tripod was filming everything: guests, food, children running around the yard. Daniel approached him. Take pictures without stopping, he said quietly, especially toast. This is important. No problem, Eric nodded, without looking up from the camera. Everything will be in the best possible way. The party was gaining momentum. Music was blaring from the speakers, old rock mixed with country. Sophie was chatting with a friend by the pool. Ethan was sitting in the corner with an album. Claire was running around with the neighbor kids. The guests drank, ate, and laughed. But Daniel saw only one thing: Lydia and Mark. They stood at the drinks table, a few steps away from each other. Lydia was holding a glass of wine. Mark was holding a beer. He said something, leaning towards her, and she laughed, lightly touching his arm. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but Daniel noticed. Then Mark winked at her, and she responded with a slight nod. Their glances crossed more often than necessary. Their jokes were too personal. They flirted right under his nose, unaware that this was their last carefree night. Daniel squeezed the soda glass until the plastic cracked. Rachel walked up to him, placing her hand on his shoulder. Are you holding on? She asked quietly. For now, yes, he muttered. But this is too much. It'll all be over soon, she squeezed his shoulder. Will Tom come? At 7, he nodded, glancing at his watch. 15 minutes left. The guests did not notice anything. Tony was telling a joke to the vendors, Sarah and Kate were dancing to the music, and Jessica was handing out pies. Mark walked over to his team, but after a couple of minutes returned to Lydia. They started talking again, and she laughed, throwing her head back. Her hand touched his shoulder again, and he leaned closer, whispering something in his ear. Daniel saw this from across the yard, and everything was boiling inside. They didn't even try to hide it. They thought he was blind, as always. He walked over to the grill, pretending to check the remains of his food. Eric was filming nearby, and Daniel glanced at him. The camera was pointed at the table with drinks. Fine. Everything will be on record. Their every gesture, every laugh. He imagined how Tom would come in with the papers, how Lydia would turn pale, how Mark would start muttering excuses. This will be their end. The clock showed 5 minutes to 7. The guests were making noise, the music was thundering, the children were screaming. Lydia and Mark were still standing together, now with new glasses, laughing at something he said. Jessica was on the other side of the yard, chatting with her neighbors, not seeing their flirting. Daniel clenched his fists. They had no idea that they had fallen into a trap. 5 more minutes, and their world will collapse. He walked to the front door, checking the street. Tom's car was already arriving. Daniel exhaled. The guests have gathered. The show was starting. The night of the party was warm, with a gentle breeze blowing the lights across Daniel Carter's backyard. The clock showed 3 minutes to 7, and the courtyard was buzzing with the voices of more than 50 guests. Mark's team from the car dealership was arguing loudly about cars. Lydia's friends Sarah and Kate were giggling over glasses of wine. The Johnson neighbors were treating the children to chips, and relatives Lydia's parents and Mark's aunt were sitting at the table discussing the weather. Sophie was chatting with a friend by the pool. Ethan was drawing in the corner. Claire was chasing the neighbor boy with a water gun. He stood at the grill, holding a glass of soda, watching Lydia and Mark. They were still at the drinks table, a few steps away from each other. Lydia, in her red dress, laughed, throwing her head back, her hair shining under the light of the garlands. Mark, beer in hand, leaned towards her, whispering something, and she giggled again, lightly touching his arm. Their flirting was open, brazen, as if they had forgotten that there were people around. Jessica, Mark's wife, stood on the other side of the yard, handing out pies and chatting with Mrs. Kelly, not noticing anything. Daniel squeezed the glass until the plastic cracked. They thought he was blind. That everyone is blind. They will soon find out how wrong they were. Eric, the videographer, walked between the guests with a camera, filming everything. Daniel caught his eye and nodded. The guy understood, pointing the lens at the table with drinks. Fine. Their every gesture will be on film. He glanced at the clock, 7 o'clock sharp. Tom should be here. Daniel walked to the front door, looked outside, and saw Tom's black sedan parking at the curb. The lawyer came out in a dark jacket with a folder in his hands and nodded to him. Daniel waved back. It's time. He returned to the yard, took the microphone from the small speaker he had connected to the playlist, and tapped it with his finger. A booming sound echoed across the crowd, and the guests began to quiet down, turning to look at him. Lydia looked up from Mark, smiling. Mark smirked, holding up his beer bottle. Daniel exhaled, feeling his heart pounding in his chest. This was his moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, holding the microphone closer to his lips. The voice sounded even though everything inside was shaking. "Thank you for coming today. It's the opening of spring, and I'm glad to see you all in our house. We're here to celebrate something special." The guests applauded, and someone shouted, "Here's to spring." Daniel smiled, but his eyes remained cold. He looked at Lydia. She stood with her arms crossed, with a satisfied smile like the queen of the evening. Beside her, Mark nodded at him like an old friend. Daniel's grip on the microphone tightened. "I want to make a toast," he continued, raising his glass of soda. "For my wife, Lydia, for her incredible work. But the main thing is for her loyalty. 20 years of marriage, 3 children, and she was always devoted." "Really, Lydia?" The crowd laughed light, good-natured laughter. But there was sarcasm in his voice, sharp as a blade, and some felt it. Sarah and Kate looked at each other. Tony from the dealership narrowed his eyes. Rachel pursed her lips, knowing what would happen next. Lydia smiled wider, not catching the trick, and nodded, raising her glass of wine. "Thank you, dear," she said, her voice ringing over the yard. "You're too kind to me." "Oh, that's not all." Daniel turned to Mark. "And for my best friend, Mark Reynolds. We've been together since college. He's Sophie's godfather. He's always there. For his friendship. Real, strong, one you can rely on. Right, Mark?" The laughter grew louder, but now there was something awkward about it. Mark grinned, slapping his chest. "Absolutely, brother. Always with you," he shouted, raising his beer. The guests began to smile, but tension began to rise. Tony coughed. Jessica looked at her husband, frowning slightly. Lydia's parents whispered to each other. Daniel's sarcasm was too obvious, too heavy to ignore. Daniel paused, lowering his glass. He looked at Lydia and Mark standing next to each other and felt the anger that had been building up for weeks burst out. They were still smiling, not suspecting anything. He nodded towards the house, where Tom was already standing at the entrance to the yard with a folder in his hands, ready to enter. "It's time." "You know," he continued, his voice becoming quieter but firmer, "loyalty and friendship are rare things. Sometimes you think they exist, and then you find out the truth. And the truth is, it's liberating." The guests fell silent. The smiles began to fade. Lydia narrowed her eyes. Her hand holding the glass froze. Mark frowned, ceasing to grin. Daniel waved to Tom, and the lawyer stepped forward, making his way through the crowd. Everyone turned to him. A whisper ran through the yard. Eric pointed the camera at Tom, then at Daniel, without missing a beat. Tom stopped in front of Lydia. His face was serious, but there was a spark in his eyes. He handed her a thick folder. "Lydia Carter," he said loudly so everyone could hear, "these are divorce papers, officially presented to you. The reason is adultery." The courtyard erupted into whispers. Lydia froze, her eyes widened, the glass of wine trembled in her hand. She looked at the folder, then at Tom, then at Daniel. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Mark stepped forward, his face turning red. "What the hell, Dan? Is it a joke?" he shouted, but his voice trembled. Daniel brought the microphone to his lips, looking directly at them. "No jokes, Mark," he said, and his voice carried across the yard, drowning out the whispers. "Lydia cheated on me with you. For years. I did DNA tests. Sophie and Ethan are not my children. They are yours. Claire is mine. You lied to me, laughed at me, and I raised your children thinking that they were my family." Lydia's parents jumped up. Her mother shouted, "Daniel, what are you talking about?" "Here's the proof," he said into the microphone. "Sophie 0% match. Ethan 0%. Claire 99.9%. You and Lydia ruined my life. But I won't give up my children. I'm their father, not you, Mark. And you will pay child support for every year of this lie." The guests were whispering. Some were filming on their phones. Eric walked around, recording every corner. Lydia finally came to her senses, threw the folder on the ground, and stepped towards Daniel, her face contorted with anger. "You're crazy," she screamed, her voice trembling. "How dare you do this in front of everyone? How dare you sleep with my best friend?" he barked back, throwing the microphone aside. "How dare you lie to me for 20 years? Mark rushed towards him, clenching his fists. "You're lying, Dan. This is nonsense," he shouted, but his voice was weak, uncertain. The crowd parted to give them space. Jessica grabbed Mark's hand. "This is true." Her voice broke. Tears flowed down her cheeks. "Mark, tell me it's not true." He turned to her, but said nothing. His face gave it all away. The color ran away. His eyes started running. Lydia screamed again. "Daniel, you're pathetic. Organize this circus." "Pathetic?" He stepped towards her, his eyes burning. "You're the pathetic one. You and your lover. Did you think I would remain blind? Now everyone knows who you are." The guests gasped, whispered, some looked away. Rachel walked over to Daniel, standing next to him, her hand resting on his shoulder. Tom stood to the side, arms crossed. With a slight smirk, his job was done. Sophie and Ethan ran from the corners of the yard when they heard screams. Sophie froze, her eyes widening. "Dad, what's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. Daniel looked at her, then at Ethan, who stood behind him with a sketchbook in his hands. Claire was the last to arrive, her face looking confused. "It's okay," he told them, trying to soften his voice. "The truth just came out. We'll figure it out." But they didn't look relieved. Sophie stepped back, Ethan clutched the album, Claire pressed herself against his leg. The guests continued to whisper. Their phones were taken. Eric did not take his camera away. Lydia fell onto a chair, covering her face with her hands. Mark stood clenching and unclenching his fists. Jessica sobbed on the side. It was chaos, and Daniel was in the center. He picked up the microphone again. "The party is over," he said, his voice as cold as steel. "Thank you for coming. See you in court." The crowd began to disperse, the whispers growing into a roar. Daniel looked at Lydia and Mark, feeling his anger subside, replaced by emptiness. He did it. The truth is revealed. Now let them try to justify themselves. The party ended and Daniel's house was empty. The guests left, taking with them the whispers and videos. Lydia left with her parents, shouting at the end that he would regret it. Mark disappeared along with the remnants of his team, and Jessica never returned. The backyard was littered with empty glasses, crumpled napkins, and scraps of food. Eric was the last to leave, handing Daniel the flash drive with the recording and muttering, "That was powerful." Silence fell like a heavy blanket over the house, but inside Daniel it rang. He did it exposed Lydia and Mark in front of everyone. But now it was necessary to talk to the children. He found them in the living room. Sophie sat on the sofa, her legs crossed, her phone lying next to her, the screen turned off. Ethan stood at the window, clutching his sketchbook, his shoulders tense. Claire was curled up in her chair, hugging her stuffed bunny, her eyes red from crying. They heard screams, saw chaos, but did not understand everything. Daniel knew it would be cruel to tell them the truth, bare and sharp as a knife. But he couldn't lie anymore. They deserved to know. He sat down on the sofa next to Sophie, placing his hands on his knees. The voice was hoarse, but firm. "Guys, we need to talk," he began, looking at them in turn. "What happened today? It's not just a quarrel. This is a truth that I myself learned only a week ago." Sophie looked up, her green pupils the same as Mark's narrowed. "Are you talking about Mom and Mark?" she asked quietly. "What did you say about DNA?" Daniel nodded, feeling his throat tighten. He took the folded sheets of paper copies of the tests from his pocket and placed them on the table. "I did DNA tests. For all of us. Sophie, Ethan, you are not my biological children. Mark is your father. Claire is my daughter." Claire sobbed as she hugged the bunny tighter. Ethan turned from the window, his face pale. "What?" he squeezed out. "Mark? But you are our dad." "Yes," Daniel clenched his fists. "I'm your dad, not by blood, but by life. I've been with you since day one, and that won't change. But your mom and Mark lied to me. They dated behind my back for years. I raised you thinking you were mine, and they laughed at me. It's cruel, I know. It hurts you to hear this, and it hurts me to say it. But I can't pretend anymore." Sophie jumped up, her voice trembling. "Are you saying that your mom cheated on you? And what are we? Not yours." She grabbed the sheet of dough and ran her eyes along the lines. 0%, 0%. "This is true." "Yes," he looked into her eyes. "I didn't want you to find out like that. But I couldn't remain silent. They destroyed our family, and I had to stop it." Ethan stepped towards the couch, throwing the album on the floor. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" he asked, his voice quiet but sharp. "Have you been waiting to put on this show?" Daniel shook his head. "I was waiting for proof." And then he decided that they would not go unpunished. Maybe it was too much to do it in front of everyone. But I wanted them to feel my pain, and I'm fighting for you. I filed for divorce and want custody of all of you. You are my children, not Mark. He has no rights over you. I will fight for you in court, and I don't care what the DNA says." Claire climbed out of her chair and ran up to him, hugging his waist. "You're my dad," she said, burying her face in his shirt. "I don't want to go to my mother. She screamed at you." Daniel hugged her, feeling tears sting his eyes. He looked at Sophie and Ethan. "I know it's hard. You can be angry with me, hate me for what I did. But I love you, all three, and I won't give you to anyone." Sophie clutched the paper in her hand, her eyes sparkling. She came up and hugged her father first. Ethan nodded, moving closer. His voice was smoother, but there was pain in it. "You taught me to draw, took me to games." He swallowed. "You are my father. I'm with you." Daniel felt the weight in his chest ease slightly. He held out his hand, and Ethan squeezed it, tightly, like an adult. Sophie sat down next to him, resting her head on his shoulder. Claire was still hugging him, her small fingers clutching his shirt. They supported him not with words, but with their presence. This was more than he expected. We can handle it, he said, hugging them all. It will be difficult. Court, moving, everything. But I won't give up. You are mine, period. Sophie raised her head, her gaze becoming firmer. I will say in court that I want to stay with you. Let them try to take me away. Me too, Ethan added. I don't want to see Mark. Claire nodded, snuggling into him further. I'm with you, Dad. Daniel smiled, sincerely for the first time in a week. They were with him. Despite the truth, the pain, the cruelty of this evening, he knew that there was a war ahead with Lydia, with Mark, with the courts. But with the children nearby, he was ready. They chose him, and that gave him power. Thank you, he said quietly. You are my everything. 3 months have passed since the night Daniel exposed Lydia and Mark at the party. 3 months of court hearings, lawyers, interrogations, and tears. The house in Austin was empty. Lydia moved to her parents in Dallas immediately after the scandal, and Daniel and the children moved to a new, smaller house in the Travis Heights area. He wanted to start over, away from the memories of the life Lydia had ruined. Today was the last day in court, and Daniel stood in front of the Austin County Courthouse, clutching a folder of documents. The decision was made. He entered the meeting room at 9 in the morning, dressed in a dark suit that he had bought especially for this day. Tom Grayson, his lawyer, sat nearby, laying out papers on the table. Opposite are Lydia with her lawyer, a thin man with glasses, and Mark, who looks like he hasn't slept in a week. Sophie, Ethan, and Claire were waiting in the hallway with Rachel. Daniel didn't want them to see it, but they insisted on being there. The judge, an elderly woman with gray hair and a stern look, entered last, and the room fell silent. Carter v. Carter and Reynolds, she announced, opening the folder. Application for divorce, custody, and alimony. I listened to the final arguments. Tom stood up, his voice sharp and confident. Your Honor, my client, Daniel Carter, seeks a full divorce from Lydia Carter due to her proven adultery with Mark Reynolds. We presented the DNA results. Sophie and Ethan Carter are Mr. Reynolds' biological children. Claire Carter is Mr. Carter's daughter. However, Daniel raised all 3 children from birth, provided for them, was their father in every sense. The children expressed a desire to stay with him. We are asking for full custody and child support from both defendants for their years of deception. Lydia jumped up, her face turning red. This is unfair, she shouted. I am their mother. He can't take them away just because he holds a grudge. Her lawyer grabbed her arm, forcing her to sit down, and spoke. Your Honor, my client admits to infidelity, but she was the primary caretaker of the children. Her connection to Mr. Reynolds does not change her right to them. We are asking for joint custody and challenging child support. Mark cleared his throat, standing up behind him. I didn't mean to, Your Honor. I'm willing to acknowledge Sophie and Ethan, but I can't pay child support. My business is suffering after everything. The judge raised her hand to interrupt him. I saw the evidence, she said coldly. DNA results, children's statements, party footage provided by Mr. Carter. Sit down. She flipped through the papers, her eyes falling on Sophie and Ethan's statements. They both wrote letters to the court. Sophie clearly stated that Mark was nobody to her, and Ethan refused to even talk to him. Claire drew a picture of her and Daniel holding hands. The judge sighed. The solution is the following, she began. The divorce between Daniel and Lydia Carter is approved. Full custody of Sophie, Ethan, and Claire Carter is awarded to Daniel Carter. Biological relatedness does not outweigh the actual upbringing and desire for children. Lydia Carter and Mark Reynolds are required to pay child support. Lydia $800 per month for Claire, Mark $200 per month for Sophie and Ethan. Children have the right to see their mother if they wish, but without coercion. Case closed. The hammer hit the table, and the room froze. Daniel exhaled, feeling the tension release from his shoulders. Tom slapped him on the back. Victory, Dan, he said with a grin. They hit it. Lydia jumped up again, her voice breaking. This is unfair. You can't take my children. She rushed to the judge, but her lawyer held her back, whispering something in her ear. She burst into tears, falling into a chair. Mark clenched his fists, his face turning purple. I will appeal this, he shouted. I don't have that kind of money. Appeal, the judge answered dryly. The decision comes into force immediately. Daniel stood up without looking at them. He left the hall where the children were waiting for him. Sophie rushed to him, hugging him. Are we staying with you? She asked, her voice trembling. Yes, he hugged her back. You are mine, the court decided. Ethan walked over, clutching the album. Okay, he said quietly. I don't want to go to him. Claire grabbed his hand, her eyes sparkling. Dad, did we win? With she asked, jumping up and down. Yes, baby, he picked her up. We won. Rachel stood nearby, smiling. I told you you could handle it, she said, patting Ethan on the head. Go home now? Home, Daniel nodded. They walked out of the court, leaving behind Lydia, who was shouting something after her, and Mark, who was muttering curses at his lawyer. It was sunny outside, and the wind was blowing clouds across the sky. Daniel put the kids in the car, taking one last look at the building. He won. The guardianship was his, and Lydia and Mark will now pay not only with money, but also with the shame that they brought upon themselves. A year has passed since the day the Austin court made a decision. Daniel Carter received custody of Sophie, Ethan, and Claire, and Lydia and Mark were required to pay child support. For Daniel, this year was a time of recovery. A new house in Travis Heights, modest but cozy, with 3 bedrooms and a small backyard, became the place where he and his children started over. They found a rhythm. Sophie was studying for final exams, Ethan was interested in graphic design, Claire was in 3rd grade and loved art classes. But for Lydia and Mark, the year had been a slow, painful decline, not a theatrical collapse, but a quiet decline, with each day bringing new reminders of what they had lost. Lydia remained in Dallas after the divorce. At first, she lived with her parents in their old house with threadbare carpet and creaky stairs where she grew up. Her room, now a temporary refuge, smelled of lavender and dust, and on the shelves were her school awards, which now seemed like a mockery. Her parents accepted her, but not without conditions. Mother Ellen, a woman with a tough character and a sharp tongue, did not miss the opportunity to remind that Lydia had disgraced the family. We warned you about Mark, she said at dinner, slicing the chicken as forcefully as if it were her daughter. Father, Jim, was silent, leafing through the newspaper, but his detachment hurt more than words. 2 months later, Lydia moved out. She couldn't stand it. She rented an apartment in the suburbs, in a gray apartment complex with thin walls and a constantly breaking elevator. 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, a second-hand sofa, that was all she could afford. Her career as a real estate agent in Austin collapsed after the party. The video made by the guests ended up in local Facebook groups, and while it didn't go viral in the global sense, it was seen and discussed enough in Austin circles that customers began to avoid her. Her name came up in conversations with the prefix "the one," and soon large deals like houses in Westlake went to competitors. In Dallas, she tried to start over by taking a part-time job at a small agency. But the market here was different, slow, with a lot of old houses that no one wanted to buy. Her income dropped to $2,000 a month, and $800 of that went toward child support for Claire. Every time the bank withdrew this amount, Lydia sat at the kitchen table, looking at the statement, and felt her stomach tighten. She couldn't even afford new clothes. She wore old suits, frayed at the elbows, and shoes that had long been in need of repair. Lydia wrote to the children long letters by hand, where she tried to explain that everything was not so simple, that she loved them. Claire sometimes responded with short notes. Hi, Mom, I'm fine. But Sophie and Ethan remained silent. She called once a week, but the conversations were strained. Sophie once said, You made your choice, Mom, and hung up. Ethan simply listened and then quietly said goodbye. Claire was softer, talked about school, but never asked when they would see each other. Lydia understood that Daniel did not forbid them to communicate. It was their choice, and this made it even more painful. She tried to establish contact with Mark after the trial. In the first weeks, she called him and left messages. We need to talk. We can get through this. But Mark rarely answered and then stopped altogether. Their connection, which seemed like true love to her, turned out to be as fragile as glass. The last time they saw each other was by chance, in a coffee shop in Austin, where Lydia came to meet a former colleague, hoping for a part-time job. Mark sat at the counter, hunched over a cup of coffee, his eyes red with fatigue. She came up and touched his shoulder. "Mark, how are you?" she asked quietly. He looked up, but there was no warmth in it. "Go away, Lydia," he said hoarsely. "You ruined everything." She stood, feeling tears burning her eyes, but left silently. Since then, she hasn't tried again. Her life was reduced to work, rare dinners with her parents and evenings with cheap wine from the supermarket. She often thought about how things could have been different if she had said no to Mark that night in Houston when the storm became their excuse. Mark remained in Austin, but his old life, a successful car dealership owner, a confident man with a wide smile, remained in the past. After the party, his business began to burst at the seams. The video circulated in local chat rooms and groups, and although it didn't make it to national channels, it was seen by everyone in Austin who mattered. Jessica left immediately after the party. She packed her things, took their 8-year-old son, Trey, and went to stay with her sister in San Antonio. The divorce went quickly. She didn't want to drag it out. Mark stayed in their apartment, but without her nurse's salary and child support, he couldn't pay the rent. 6 months later, he moved into a one-room studio on the outskirts, bare walls, a creaky bed, the smell of dampness. Mark drank. Not every day, but more often than before. In the evenings, he went to the Rusty Nail Bar, a couple of blocks from his house, where the bartender already knew his order: a whiskey and soda. There, they sometimes recognized him. Someone patted him on the shoulder, someone looked away. One day, a drunk guy at the counter said, "Are you the one who slept with your friend's wife?" "Cool, man," and laughed. Mark squeezed the glass, but said nothing. He didn't fight, he didn't have the strength. He tried to establish contact with Sophie and Ethan. Wrote them letters, sent gifts, Sophie headphones, Ethan a set of pencils. But everything came back with a note from Sophie: "Don't write to me." Ethan didn't answer at all. Mark realized that they had chosen Daniel, and that hit him harder than losing his business or his wife. He wasn't their father, not in the sense that Daniel was. And this realization came to him every night when he lay in the dark, listening to the noise of cars outside the window. Lydia and Mark did not communicate again after that meeting in the coffee shop. Their connection, fueled by secrets, could not withstand the light of truth. Lydia blamed Mark for his weakness, for not supporting her after the trial. Mark blamed Lydia for everything, for the first step, for pushing him to this. But deep down, both knew that they themselves had chosen this path. They weren't movie villains, just people who gave in to temptation and couldn't stop. Daniel heard about them through mutual friends. Lydia filed an appeal for alimony, but the court rejected it. Her income did not allow it. Sophie was finishing school with good grades. Ethan won a local drawing competition. Claire was learning to play the flute. They rarely mentioned Lydia or Mark, and he didn't force them to. Sometimes Claire would ask, "Does Mommy miss me?" And he answered honestly, "I think so." But it didn't go further than talk. One evening, Daniel was sitting on the porch with coffee, watching the sunset. A year ago, he thought he had lost everything: family, trust, himself. But now he had more. The kids chose him, and it wasn't about his DNA, it was about who he was to them. Lydia and Mark paid their price, a slow decline, where every day reminded them of the past. And he looked forward, knowing that he had won not only in court, but also in life. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.